next up we have Andy Favell. He's ex-police operations, and then has made the transition to cyber, so he's relatively new to the space. So it should be an interesting talk about how to transition into cyber and the skills that he's learned through a particular program. So Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Robin, for inviting me to speak this morning. I suppose, as you said, I've been retooling, I've been retransitioning. COVID has partly brought this on, and I discovered CAPSLOCK. And what is CAPSLOCK? Well, CAPSLOCK is an education program. They bill themselves as an intensive online cyber boot camp, which I had the pleasure of attending between March and June. And what took me to CAPSLOCK really was that I was searching for a course, for a qualification that would help me demystify the world of cyber. From my previous work in operational policing, learning and development, management consultancy, I've already got some understanding of cybersecurity, and I was certainly really interested in it, but I was finding it quite difficult sometimes to understand certain aspects of it. And I was finding increasingly I was being asked questions from an information security type perspective, usually when I was carrying out investigations, particularly from a HR perspective, and particularly when liaising with fellow professionals like Pete. There were certainly some things that I didn't feel I knew or understood well enough to embody good practice. So I wasn't sure necessarily about unlocking my potential, but I was certainly ready to understand how things fitted into the big cyber jigsaw. So back at the end of 2020, early 2021, when thanks to COVID, I've got some time on my hands, I did lots of Googling and found lots of potential courses, but none of them quite fitted the bill. Then I hit upon CAPSLOCK, and CAPSLOCK are a new business. They've only been alive 12 months or so. And I was immediately a bit suspicious because it seemed to be just the sort of thing I was looking for. So like all good investigators, I did some due diligence and they seemed to kind of check out. And I then booked a call with Lorna Armitage, who was one of the founders. And although I hate to admit it, within 5 minutes, I was hooked, absolutely hooked. So with a simple online application, I was accepted into the kind of pre-course section of their website. And really this encompassed some simulated immersive labs, it's a simulated environment, immersive labs. Most of these were pretty basic, some were intermediate, and it included all sorts of things like, the basics of the command line, the basics of government structure and governance, the basic role that encryption plays, this sort of thing. And you had to score 3,000 points on various pathways in order to be accepted. And I did my pre-course during February. It was about 8 hours of learning, something like this. And then my start date arrived in March, very quickly, in fact. And in terms of curriculum, CAPSLOCK published several interesting infographics on their website, and their program is delivered virtually using what they call a digital campus, which they use the Canvas VLE for, and Zoom. And what they've done is they've grouped their syllabus into 5 problem areas, and this is actually a screenshot of their Canvas. So hidden behind each of these tiles, so understanding business, security by design, access management, offensive, defensive, and business continuity management, are all sorts of modules. And I think my favorite module, or my favorite problem area, was security by design, because it was probably the area I knew least about. And the things that I really enjoyed learning about in the first were networking fundamentals and cloud infrastructure. So just the sort of topology that Pete was talking about earlier on. Perhaps less interesting, but really, really useful, was the mind-melting world of applied cryptography. But all of the 5 problem areas had similar underpinning modules, all with their own resources. Now, I mentioned ago that CAPSLOCK used Zoom. A big premise of what they used as a teaching tool was team-based learning. And at the very start of the program, we were all allocated into small teams of 4 and 5, and we remained in these teams throughout. And really the premise of team-based learning is simple. It's do some individual learning, share it in the group, in your small group, and then consolidate this learning in a wider group with a debrief from the tutors, which sounds really basic, but it was actually really successful, or I found it really successful. And to put this into some kind of context, A typical day looked a bit like this. So prior to the session, we were expected to do some pre-reading. All of the sessions were delivered interactively on Zoom, which sounds a bit bewildering because there were 53 on our cohort, I think, but it was actually quite fun. We do our pre-reading, it would usually be 1 or 2 hours, and the resources would be on Canvas. Most of these would be open source resources. Some of it would be YouTube. There would also be some labs delivered by Rangeforce. And then we'd all meet online at 9:30. There'd be an individual multi-choice assessment test, but we wouldn't know the answers. The answers wouldn't be revealed. And then we'd join our breakout rooms in our mini teams, and we'd do exactly the same test, but this time we would know the answers. So we'd be able to know if they're correct or not. And then we would debrief these back in the main room with everyone, with the tutors, and the tutors would then give a mini lecture or some kind of input. And this was actually really effective because it allowed us to look at the live assessment scores and just focus in on the aspects that we either didn't understand or we felt as a group, as a wider cohort, that we needed to understand better. So that was kind of the first part of the day. And then the next part of the day was what CAPSLOCK call an application activity. And again, in our team breakout rooms, we would then have to research some good practice of a particular topic area. And then using Google Workspaces, we'd work interactively together to produce a document, a presentation, some notes, and then we would take it in turns to present these back to the main room to share our findings. We'd then take a break, and then we'd do a similar activity. However, this was usually a scenario and case study based, and CAPSLOCK very helpfully had invented a fictitious and rapidly expanding international company called Plum. And Plum had got 5 global divisions, and they all had their own cybersec problems. So over the 16 weeks, I reckon we did about 100 of these mini activities. And here are just a few examples that I plonked down to give you a flavor. So for example, in head office, there was solving a problem on designing suitable network architecture for head office and the corresponding divisions, and what that topology from a basic level could or should look like. For defense services, we had to consider what to do with various types of end-of-life data at various different classification levels, and this included things like the contractual and legal issues. For managed services, we had to look at Plum's own ISMS, their information security management system, and how we would set about achieving internal compliance. For software services, it was about wider threat assessment and how DevSecOps could be used, particularly with a dispersed team, and particularly with a team that was using bring your own devices. And then systems engineering, we were considering things like incident response and how this fitted in with their wider business continuity and disaster recovery solutions. I also really found the activities on key management and the cloud labs interesting, because these were things that I previously hadn't had any experience of awareness of. And I think at this juncture, by the end of the course, there were various puns being made about how jammy the senior management team were at Plum, because they just seemed to get away with it all the time. And there were so many security flaws. I think we all decided that we'd all be mad to work for Plum in any capacity, because they're probably going to be prosecuted very, very soon. But joking aside, we did think the practical approach was a really helpful way of learning, because it was all applied. And as you've probably gleaned by now, there was quite a lot more to just the learning in the program that CAPSLOCK was offering. So before I wrap up, I thought it's just worth mentioning a few other things that weren't obvious, but I found really valuable. And the first is the diversity of the team. So some of the tutors, some of the presenters, some of the lecturers, some of the assessors were from academia, but some were also taken from industry, including guest speakers. So I thought that gave a really good kind of cross-section of experiences, different perspectives, and the tutors were quite prepared to challenge each other and talk about their experiences in that context. The next thing was inclusivity. So CAPSLOCK offer full and part-time courses. They run the part-time courses in the evening, and they're particularly keen to encourage more women into cyber. CAPSLOCK also offer a shared income agreement. So this allows delegates to pay for their course fees by salary sacrifice, but only once their salaries got up to the dizzy heights of 27K, which I thought was really a good thing to do. They were also really supportive and encouraging people from a non-technical background. So just to give you a flavour, the other colleagues that were in my little team, we've got an ex-yacht skipper. We've got someone who had previously been assessing insurance claims. We've got a graphic designer, and then the two people who were kind of, well, Adam was extremely technical because he was a web developer, but knew very little about security. And then I'd come from a general consultancy background that knew, a tiny about everything, but wasn't actually particularly helpful. But to build on that, each team was also allocated an experienced industry mentor. So as a team, we met with our mentor, who was a CISO for an insurance company, every other week, as well as one-to-one. And in fact, I'm hoping to catch up with him for coffee later. And if any of you are interested in supporting CAPSLOCK with their mentoring program, I know they're always on the lookout, and we can talk to Pete Jones, because Pete's done a stint as a CAPSLOCK mentor. I won't put you on the spot, Pete, to ask whether you found it any good or not. You can save that for later. And lastly, CAPSLOCK also had a dedicated career outcomes manager, Gary Billings, and Gary had come from a cyber recruitment background. So he also had a really valuable insight as to how the program related to industry. And I suppose it kind of embodied the whole CAPSLOCK ethos, really, in that it wasn't just about teaching. It was actually about getting relevant cyber work. And I think last time I spoke with Gary, of the 53 of us that were on the initial cohort, 30 of us are now working either directly in cyber or in cyber related roles. So not a bad measure of success, really. And lastly, I really like the broadness of the syllabus, the learning materials that were provided. We had access to a number of learning resources that otherwise you would have had to pay for. And it encompassed so many of the various areas of cybersec. So to wrap up, was it worth it for me? Was it worth it? Well, I think it was. I mean, ask me again in 6 months, but I think, yes, it did involve significant outlay in that it was 16 weeks of my time, which thanks to COVID I had. The course is 8.5 grand plus VAT, so not an insignificant amount, but I do think it really improved my knowledge. I think it improved my understanding, particularly in an applied learning context that's going to be commercially useful as a general consultant. If I had to hone in on just 3 aspects, I'd probably mention networking fundamentals and topology, as Pete alluded to. I'd probably say I've got a better understanding as to how access management works and is important, including the basics of Kerberos, three-way handshake. And I think overall, just it achieved what it needed to do for me, in that it joined up the dots. I could see the fish from the shoal, the wood from the trees, the bits from the bites, and especially in things like the cyber threat intelligence, cyber threat modeling, governance, risk and compliance, all of the things that I could draw from my policing and apply in a real industry type context. It's worth mentioning the course included these 4 certificates, and it's also worth mentioning it's accredited by CSEC, and we all graduated and got our CSEC affiliate status. So overall, yeah, I would say it was worth it. There was one downside to the program though, and that's I'm even more aware now as to how poor some organizations' cybersecurity is. So yeah. I hope that was a helpful overview. If you've got any questions, do hit me on LinkedIn or check out CAPSLOCK AC. Thanks, Jeff.